As many of you know, my name is John Lasciuto. I'm the gallery director here, and it's such a pleasure to have you all join us tonight. I really want to welcome you to the artist talk for a tenuous framework, and this is with Shana McCaw and Brent Budsberg. We're really excited to have you join us to invite, and we invite you to stay after the talk and attend the reception as well. We are going to have a food truck, so if anyone is interested in partaking in that, there are tickets to get the food. So you'll need to go to the gallery assistant outside the food truck and get a ticket so that you can have some dinner. And no food or drink is allowed in the gallery, so just be mindful of that as well. And then after the talk in here, we'll have a short Q&A. So if you have any questions, we'll welcome those. And then I encourage you to approach Brent and Shana. They're very easygoing and happy to talk with you in the gallery about their work as well. They also produced a artist piece as part of the exhibition that's a takeaway for you. So it's a poster and an essay, so please look for that in the gallery on the table by the door and take one home with you. We produce these exhibitions with a lot of help, and so I have a number of thank yous that I would like to express. First of all, the director of the Bauer School of Music and the Arts, Christoph Bernacki, thank you for hosting this talk in the music building. Also, our events coordinator, Joanna Gnomes, the music technology coordinator, Alex Webb, our assistant curator, Annika Sturdivant, collections manager, Caitlin Roslin, our lead gallery assistant, Amanda Claro, and our gallery assistants, Ash Cohen, Emily Leeper, Soph Shikes, and Eva Poirier. So thank you all for all your help. And we have some incredible donors who have made this exhibition possible. So specifically, I'd like to thank Jean and Lee Seidler, the Wasmer Endowment, WGCU Public Media, and the State of Florida Department of State and Division of Arts and Culture. So thank them for all of their help as well. So Brent Budsberg and Shana McCaw have been collaborating for over 20 years, and their art practice includes performance and installation, sculpture, photography, video, and more. And these different approaches are multi-layered, and they result in exhibitions such as the one you're going to see tonight. They've participated in a variety of residencies, such as the Kohler Arts Center in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, the Goldwell Open Air Museum in Death Valley, Nevada, and the Center for Land Use Interpretation Residency site in Wendover, Utah. They've had a number of solo exhibitions as well, including the York and Los Angeles, Spaces Gallery in Cleveland, Ohio, the Wright Museum of Art in Beloit, Wisconsin, and the Soap Factory in Minneapolis, Minnesota. They also, on top of their art practice, they run a business called Current Projects, and it's a Milwaukee-based design studio that collaborates with museums, artists, filmmakers, and individual clients. They combine historic research and meticulous craft with contemporary design, creating exhibits, furniture, film sets, and artworks. So for any of you who are interested in how does an artist make a living, certainly you can as an artist, but this is a great example of how those skills translate into other business practices, and certainly they can talk more about that as well with you. Brent and Shana were instrumental not only in the exhibition, but also in my own development as an artist and curator. And we have collaborated together for many years prior to my move to Florida. And for the last 5 years, we've been discussing the idea of an exhibition here and in the Wasmer Art Gallery. About a year and a half ago, they proposed the idea of a tenuous framework, and we've been working on that ever since. So it's been a really exciting journey for me to see the work develop and to be realized in the space. So I'm excited for you to see what we've done. They've been here since Friday, working with our gallery staff and myself to transform the space, and they've spent time with our senior project students discussing how the exhibition was conceived and constructed to help them imagine their own exhibitions later in the semester. And so on behalf of myself and the students, the faculty, and the community, thank you for being here, and please help me welcome Brent and Shana.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. Well, let's see. Should we start? So actually, it was fantastic that John mentioned our history together in Milwaukee, because, yeah, we actually, our first couple of images take us way, way back to that time. So this is special kind of for John to show a couple of images. So when you go into the show, you'll see that we work with miniatures and also just scaled down objects. Like we have a house in the gallery that is not a full-scale house. And so we've often worked with small scale for a really long time. And this is actually the first miniature that we ever made. And it's, as you can see, it's a car that has a miniature parking garage inside it. And it's entirely made of foam and hot glue and paper. Here's a detail of the paper cars. But this was a show that John helped organize. And in Milwaukee, when we were all young artists and we were kind of trying to figure out how to make work and make interesting events happen, we were all organizing different events in really any venue that we could find. And so a parking garage happened to work as an art venue in this case. But we have another example here, and I'll let Brent talk about this one.
Sure. So we were approached with an opportunity to do a one-night performance-based show at the Performing Arts Center in Milwaukee, and we got together with a group of 5 artists, and we were just started spitballing. We really didn't have any ideas to begin with, and I had audaciously been planning on, I thought I should do an opera. It seemed like something that should be on the bucket list I should be able to check off. So I proposed this idea of doing an opera about a housefly waking up on the windowsill in the spring after the frozen windowsill thawed out and reanimated. And so
yes, and
to my surprise, everyone went for it. So that's what we did.
And as a side note, I know you guys live in Florida and this might not happen, but in northern places, that really does happen. Flies will sort of go into a cryogenic stasis in the winter, and they can reawaken in the spring. And so, yeah.
Right, so typically they have a 24-hour or so lifespan, but if they happen to not die and go into cryogenic state in the fall, they may have a much longer life, although not conscious for all of it. And all of this played out in the
on stage
of the stage set.
But you can see, we collaborated. There was a smaller group of artists that kind of conceived of this idea, but there was many more people involved. There's dancers on stage. There was an opera singer. There was a small 3-piece band and actors. So it was a pretty large collaboration.
And maggots.
And yeah, the dancers actually in this scene, I think, are enacting.
It's sort of a maggot dance.
Yeah. So you can ask either me or Brent or John more about this later if you like. And here's just one other image. This, I guess maybe in a way, this also helped us think a lot about mixed media and multimedia presentations, which I think actually the show we did in the gallery has that feeling as well. And this show from way back when, this fly opera, included everything from shadow puppets that you see here to really overbuilt on our part props, like really elaborate props. So we were starting to kind of think about these multimedia presentations way back when. So kind of jumping a little bit into the future, this is the first kind of hyper-realistic miniature that we made, and the house in this slide is actually, that house is in the gallery, so you'll see that, and that's kind of in a way, that house itself is kind of an ancestor in our work, because we've been kind of referencing it and rebuilding it and changing it over, I don't know, about 15 or so years. This piece is called Farmstead, and this was done at Innova Gallery in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and when we walked through to kind of start thinking about what we would do in this space, it was totally empty. And so one of the things that really influenced us was just that sort of linear wood floor, and it really started us thinking about what if we just sort of transformed the gallery into farm fields, like plowed farm fields, which is something that's ubiquitous in the Midwest. And it also kind of launched us thinking about how really that's relevant subject matter for both of us, because we both have rural family, people who live and farm, in the Midwest. So that was something that made a lot of sense to us.
And at the time we were, our relationship was somewhat new, and we were we married at this point?
I don't think so.
It was right around the time when we were
Yeah.
maybe engaged.
Yeah.
And so we were meeting each other's families, and we were spending a lot of time driving around the rural Midwest. So I think that was sort of like something we were seeing a lot of and just thinking a lot about and trying to understand who each other were and where we came from and how we explained to each other who we are,
Yeah,
each of us
exactly.
is. And so I think this was sort of this attempt to like sort of understand our sort of ancestral past in a way. And when we made this, we sort of thought of it as it was never meant to be anything that we did that we continued. But interestingly, it planted a lot of seeds and asked a lot of questions that we kept coming back to in our work.
Yeah, and I think just in terms of artistic devices, this exhibition also kind of, we did a lot of things that we have continued into the future. So this is an example of a miniature corn crib. These things are this one's probably about 9-10 inches high. And what's happening here is that it's disappearing into the wall. So what we did was we kind of took this imagined farmstead, which was like a house and several barns and outbuildings and a big extension of fence that went around the whole property. And we just kind of slapped that imagined farmstead right onto the gallery floor plan. So if a wall in the gallery came down right in the middle of a building, like it did in this corn crib, that's exactly what we did in the gallery. So the corn crib cuts off here, and I think this was an example where you could walk around to the other side of the wall and see the rest of the corn crib coming out on the other side of the wall.
And the largest gallery in this museum had we had the whole top floor, and there were, I think, 3 different galleries we ran. And the largest gallery had nothing but a running fence.
Which you can see in the background of this photo.
Right. And so that was a really interesting thing because this fence is about 3 inches tall, but it still acted as a psychological barrier. It was kind of right in the middle of the room, and people would come and see it, and they wouldn't go over it.
That's right.
Which was really interesting.
It was, yeah.
It wouldn't take much.
We
but.
took note of that. And then just one other image from that show just kind of shows you the other sort of thing we did here was, you can see there's a figure here so you can get a sense of scale, but also there was one lit window in the back side of that farmhouse. And so first of all, what it did is it kind of rewarded the curious viewer, like the person who would actually go around all the pieces, because you couldn't see that from the primary view. And I think that's another thing we're doing in this gallery. You really have to walk around everything to see all the hidden Easter eggs. But then we also had the one lit window was kind of really interesting to us because it sort of conveyed this narrative that maybe this dilapidated farmhouse was still inhabited by one person who's kind of trying to still hang on. Maybe it's, everyone else in the family has passed on, or we don't know. I mean, it was an open-ended narrative for really the viewer to complete, but we wanted to just give that little hint that there's more going on.
Yeah, so these are ruins, and it's sort of referencing a sort of dying way of life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was influential to us driving around the Midwestern countryside, too.
And so what was really interesting is these pieces, although we just thought of this as a one-off exhibit, as we started getting more opportunities, we kind of kept coming back to these, and we kind of kept thinking about the house. And over the years now, we've built, dozens of iterations of the house, and several of them are in this exhibit. And the next one here you'll see, this is sort of an abstracted version of the house. It's a piece we call Reaction, which is kind of maybe a reference to maybe a nuclear reaction or like a mutation in a way. So this is this sort of reflected house that almost looks like this object that's just sort of rolled into place. And here, instead of that warm light coming out of the windows, you've got a flickering blue light. And so the hearth has been replaced by the television set, right?
Yeah, and I think because we were thinking a lot about how these old buildings that were maybe built in the late 1800s or around the turn of the century are being inhabited by modern people. So sometimes the purposes that the house was built for instance, wouldn't really work for modern life anymore. And so there has to be a lot of these strange retrofits and things like that. Like I know one thing that we encounter all the time, like in our neighborhood, is that you have a room and there might be only one outlet in it. And it's like, it's this huge project to try to figure out how to run more electrical. So so I mean, that's just a basic example, but there was kind of a collision happening, and we sort of represented that in this way. The other thing that we've done a lot, and again, this is represented in the show, is repurposing objects that we've made for other installations. So there are several times when an installation might only exist for one iteration, and then we sort of disassemble it and we use parts in other types of installations. So you can see here's the barn that was from the original farmstead installation, reconfigured into a new way of showing it. So this is, kind of suspended from the wall with this jute rope. The jute rope shows up again in the show across the way. And so when you approach this piece, I'm assuming, you're kind of curious as to why and how this is suspended in this way. But what we were hoping is that people would sort of look at this and say, well, I don't know what's going on here. This is very strange, but, it seems secure. It seems like it's hanging there. And then you walk around to the other side and you see that your expectations are completely untrue. So it was kind of in a way about trust, or even about faith in a way, faith that something seems believable, but when you kind of get to go behind the curtain, maybe that isn't the case.
Yeah, so at one point we were approached by Linden Sculpture Garden to do an exhibit in their series, which is called Inside Outside. And the way this worked is they have a gallery where we do a show inside the gallery, but then we'd also do something out on the grounds of the Linden Sculpture Garden. And this coincided with the Winter Carnival. And so they had all sorts of artists doing outdoor activities in the snow. And so what we decided to do was do a performance piece. And we wanted to kind of think about this house that we've been working with for quite a while, and think about, okay, so let's expand this. Let's go inside the house. Let's unpack this a little more. Who are the inhabitants of this house? So we created these two characters for this performance, which we kind of thought of as the inhabitants of this house. Here they are, kind of emerging from a sort of white cloud. And it's also kind of referencing, so these are these sort of settler, pioneer sort of characters that maybe loosely reference our own ancestors and when they immigrated to the United States. And also we're thinking a lot about finding old black and white photographs in antique stores, right? And you find these photographs, and there's these people who had full, rich lives, but there's no story around it at all. So you have to, there are these orphaned objects, and you pick them up, and your instinct is to build a story around this image. And so this is how we started with these characters. We knew almost nothing about them, and they still remain unnamed. And so we kind of think of them as like those photos you find in an antique store. And through working with the characters, we've learned much more about them. So we've used this sort of intuitive process to let it evolve on its own and sort of build this kind of emergent narrative around who these characters are.
Right, so the performance that we did at Linden Sculpture Garden for the Winter Carnival, we actually had a show in their gallery space at the same time, so this was kind of an accompanying performance. And it happens in the winter. It was funny.
The white stuff, by the way, is called snow.
It was in February, and the day before this, there was no snow. And we were a little bit disappointed by that because our concept for our performance, we just knew it would be a lot better with snow. And so luckily, I think it was that night and that day, it snowed
right.
8 or 10 inches.
In fact, it was snowing while we did it.
Yeah, so the weather cooperated. But basically what we ended up doing was we kind of staked out an outline of the foundation of this house that we keep referencing. And our performance was we would go kind of back into the woods and get this sort of sled, and we'd pull it out, and then we were digging the trench in the shape of that house foundation and putting all the sod on the little sled, taking it away, coming back with charcoal and filling the trench with charcoal, so that at the end of the performance, we lit all the charcoal on fire, and you can see there's kind of an audience gathered because we're kind of in the final stages of our performance. Also, the filmmaker there is Tape Bunker, who who shot all the footage for the film that you'll see in the gallery. And then
so this was the result, and what was really interesting about this, which we didn't entirely anticipate, was that it actually took on a certain three-dimensionality, but in the form of walls made of heat.
Mm-hmm.
So you'd walk into this, it was actually a heated space. And you'd get above these things, and you could sense the architecture, the sort of implied walls, but they're made of heat. It was really
It was a
wonderful
very
and
interesting and unexpected thing. We later on, we kind of did a book release at Linden Sculpture Garden because we created a book that had some photographs from that performance, but then also some subsequent residencies, and so we reenacted it in the summer. And I just threw this in here because it's obviously a completely different experience in the summer. I think this was in June or so, and in Milwaukee it was still cold enough in June that actually it felt good to have the fire.
But the scar remained for many years in the grass. Right. And so then we had this residency shortly after this at the Center for Land Use Interpretation in Wendover, Utah. And it was out on the Salt Flats. You probably know these salt flats from many films and commercials and things. So it's where they do the Bonneville Speedway, where they try to like break the land speed record, you know. So it's just this sort of, what we thought anyway was this kind of endless expanse of white. And we were really fascinated by that after working in the snow. And also we've been thinking about the gallery as this sort of attempt at a void, at this sort of white cube that tries to disappear. So we were thinking a lot about this, and we were sort of looking for versions of nowhere. And so we went out there sort of looking for that. And you know, when we did the performance with the characters, we thought that was a one-off thing. It was but when we went to the residency, we kind of packed the costumes just in case. But our intention was to go out there and shoot these miniature architectural forms that we'd done. And so here's one of them. Here's the house shot out on the Salt Flats, and I think we've thrown a smoke bomb in there to give it an effect that maybe it's on fire or maybe it's like in mist or fog.
Yeah, we call this photograph Cloud Maker because it kind of looks like the house is creating the clouds somehow. So
we did a couple of these, but then we're out there with not much to do, out in the middle of nowhere, and we had the costumes, so we started messing around with the costumes. And what we found was that we actually spent most of our time out there working with these characters and sort of developing these characters by improvising with the landscape and with found props, and with a camera. So we're sort of doing these performances for the camera. A lot of still photography, but also some video photography. And they took on this really interesting sort of cinematic nature. They often looked like movie posters, and they were very, very dramatic because of the sort of epic landscape.
The other thing that was bizarre is that we were expecting to go out there and be presented with the, sort of archetypal salt flat, which is like a super flat desert that's salt. It's like white, and there's like salt crystals all over the place, and it's incredibly dry. But we were out there in May, and I don't know if this is normal, but the salt flat was flooded in a lot of places because a lot of rain had fallen. So we were instead presented with like a 4-inch deep lake that went like 42 miles. Or in some cases, it would just be mud. And so this photograph shows Brent's character kind of interacting with the discovery of that mud. And, he comes from the Midwest, this character, and he might be a farmer. He might be someone who kind of understands how to plow and plant a field. So what do you do when you're encountered with just like miles of like infertile mud, So a lot of what, you were doing in this location was just kind of feeling like completely inadequate, or like you couldn't really do anything.
Yeah, these almost became these sort of, because they are sort of Midwestern farmers, this Western landscape became almost this like sort of dreamscape, often like representing their sort of anxieties and dystopia.
So that kind of helped Brent start to explore different psychological aspects of his character. And same thing for me. My character kind of emerged as someone who's a little more symbiotic with the environment. So she was kind of able to like confront adversity in the environment in a little bit I don't know, maybe slightly more graceful way, or at least maybe with more curiosity instead of frustration. So in a way, she's not really doing anything here, although it kind of looks like she might almost be floating on the water. But here's another example. And at this point, too, this photograph switches us to another residency in the desert. We are in Death Valley at this point, at the Gold Well.
Yeah, looking for versions of Nowhere again. And intentionally, we didn't do much research on it, because we kind of wanted to be surprised by what we found. But we had this image of the desert as just being like endless sand dunes, which is totally not what it was at all. It was like this incredibly varied landscape.
Yeah, here I am actually amongst a bunch of volcanic rock, and it was this place that just every few miles you drove, it felt like the environment shifted again. So there was really a lot for us to work with, and we spent a lot of time driving around. Yeah.
Yeah, and then we were at this point. We had done some work with the characters, and this was our second residency where we sort of went out this time intentionally to work with the characters. And at this point, we had already been thinking a little bit more about Hollywood and about some of those influences that had seeped into the work. And so we did a performance piece, and we developed this while we were there. But we did a performance piece that sort of directly engaged with this Hollywood trope of the kind of lone figure walking through the desert with only a couple sips of water left in his canteen and sort of dying of thirst. And so we did this piece called Desert versus Desert, which, explain the title.
It was a performance, basically. I don't know if you said that, but it was a performance that we did that I don't remember exactly how long it took, but we walked from sort of the parking lot where all the tourists park across the dunes. And, Brent was sort of enacting this Hollywood trope that he just mentioned, and kind of like every once in a while, like trying to get more water out of his canteen and like staggering. And actually, I'll just advance the slide so you can see eventually his character like collapses and he writes like his last will and testament on a little scrap of paper. And so we were trying to like super ham it up. But some of the photographs, so while Brent was doing this, I was running around trying to get photographs and video. And so inevitably things like this happened, which is just like tourists were in the background. And so we really felt like, we were kind of in this very dichotomous place where it could be a place that had, like Hollywood goes there to try to.
Right. I think the reason I asked you that is because I forgot why we called it that momentarily, but I think that I think it was because we had a very different conception of what the desert was, and it was so much based on what Hollywood has shown us, right? And then when we went out there, it was something totally different. So the desert versus desert was sort of like the real desert versus our conception of the desert. Yeah, I think that's sort of what we were thinking about there.
Right. So this ended up being like kind of one of our best documentary photos from that because it so clearly illustrated what Brent just explained. We also, at the same time, and we put this in here because you will see some photography in the exhibition that we kind of refer to as concrete photography, because we're sort of treating a printed photo like a sculptural material. And so we're doing things like excavating into the photos. We've done things where we've like crumpled photos up or folded them in different ways. And this is an example. This photograph's called Element, and the photograph was taken in Death Valley. But you can see what we did was we mounted it and with some space behind the photo so that we could cut out the cube that I was holding. It was actually a little metal cage. So.
And you'll see several different versions of sort of concrete photography in the exhibit. Coming to photography as sculptors, we really sort of had this urge to turn it back into an object. And I think that's something that's happening with the film as well, that you'll see. There's like normally you're sort of seeing the film just through through the rectangle of the theater or the screen, and but what we've done here is we've brought those objects into the same space with it. So we're trying to think both physically about the objects, but also representationally in image at the same time.
Right. Yeah. So kind of, sort of switching gears to the film. So. The film, so we have this film that we created called The Inhabitants. So we were very directly thinking about the imagined inhabitants of this house that we've been working with forever, and kind of starting to develop those characters further and use film to create an actual storyline and a narrative. So the exhibition is kind of centered around the film because it was completed fairly recently, and then we wanted to bring a lot of elements together in the show. So you will see sculptures that were maybe originally meant as props, or vice versa, sculptures we made that were then used as props in the film. And then there's a lot of photography of these characters, and there's even one new piece that kind of explores a new aspect of imagined space inside this house. So, yeah.
And I think, like, just thinking about why we started the film project, I think we were, in some of those residencies out west, we had experimented a little bit with video pieces involving these characters, but we didn't really have the equipment or the skills, really, even to really represent it in a way that sort of dovetailed with that kind of those cinematic images we were creating, right? So we were really beginning to think very consciously about Hollywood and how Hollywood represents the past, and we wanted to evoke that in film. So what we did is we solicited the help of a filmmaker named Tate Bunker, who was our collaborator on this project, and he had done this amazing project called Studies in Space that was just like so incredibly beautifully shot. So we just knew that he would be somebody who could help us achieve this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is a still from the film. And just to kind of introduce my character, I guess, her sort of actions in the film, it's a silent film. There's sound, but there's no dialogue. She is kind of this caretaker in this space that's depicted here, which actually the set was the Chipstone Foundation in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. They have a mansion, kind of an early American style mansion, and it's full of their collection of early American objects. So it's a really interesting space with a lot of historic objects. And so my character in the film is kind of this like lonely caretaker of this space. So she's kind of going room to room and like dusting and interacting with the furniture, but she seems relatively alone inside this house. But she is able to, there's this one room that she has that she's able to kind of escape to and do maybe things that she's more interested in. So she seems to be interested in nature and possibly in these explorations of nature, maybe making medicines, maybe different types of alchemies, or maybe just drawing or looking at objects from nature. So the room is full of plants and dried things, and she's always in there like mixing up little concoctions.
Right.
And then meanwhile...
Yeah, and I think it's important to note, too, that this film was made without a script and without a specific timeline involved. We were all sort of directors of the film. Yeah. So very different approach than I think the typical film project. And it was very much a hybrid project in which the things we were building for the film made their way out into the gallery, and the things we had already made as sculptures made their way into the film. So there's this sort of like fluid kind of cross-pollination happening with different art forms. My character is sort of continuing his sort of misadventures that he started out west. He seems to be getting himself into all these Sisyphean tasks or trying to achieve things that he can't quite muster. And so here he is building this house, which you'll see. And again, this is another version of that same farmhouse that we have him building out on the prairie. There's another shot from the film, and you can see the house in the background there, that stick frame of the house. So this is an earlier version of the house before it's fully built. In this narrative, he's only partially completed, and he's kind of given up on it. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit, but you can see that installation is in the gallery in a new form, in a new configuration. Because this had no script and we didn't really start with specific notions of what we wanted these characters to be, we were trying very hard to really just work more intuitively and let them sort of emerge, almost be like a participant in this process rather than people who are trying to create some sort of specific result. We were doing things like going to antique stores and just like seeing things that we were drawn to, and we wouldn't necessarily know why. But like one example of that was these stilts that we found in an antique store, and I started practicing on these stilts, and we started shooting my character walking on stilts in the deep snow, and there's scenes where he's building the stilts. And there's a number of works that have to do with that sort of, I don't know, something about my character wanting to reach upward. And and there was other works we were doing that kind of were along that same theme. And what was interesting is people would ask us, well, what's with the stilts? And we wouldn't really have a good answer, right? But then we started thinking about some of these family stories we'd been told, and we were like, I wonder if this has to do with Clifford Thompson, right? So one of the family stories that that is in my own family history is I have a great uncle named Clifford Thompson who was purportedly the tallest man in the world when he was alive. He claimed to be 8'7", and there's a ring hung in the gallery, which you'll see, and it's hung at 8'7". The shadow of it is at about gallery viewing height, so average height on the wall. But on further research, we found out that actually wasn't his height. He was actually lying about his height. So even though he was legitimately certainly one of the tallest people in the world, he still had this need to be taller, and he lied about it. So he was in the circus for a while, and the ring that you see in the gallery is a novelty item you could have bought if you went and saw this sort of circus act with him in it. And then he had ambitions. He wanted to get out of the circus. He went and got his law degree, became a lawyer. So it was just really kind of interesting to see that, start making these connections and seeing it seeping into the work. If you go to the next slide, this is I did a artist residence, or no, it was actually a class I took at Penland. And I was working with somebody else at the time as my character, so I'm actually shooting someone else here. But here again, this is a relatively short guy, but I'm shooting him as though he's this giant. And I wasn't thinking about Clifford Thompson at the time, and then the next piece too, which is in the show, is also from that class at Penland where I was working with bamboo, and I created this ladder that, bamboo sort of tapers and tapers to nothing, right? And so the ladder I built from it, it sort of appears to just be an infinite ladder that keeps going up into the sky, and it's not propped up on anything, and my character is like trying to climb this ladder. And there's a video of this where he breaks the ladder and falls. So it's this sort of futile attempt. But we started making these connections and seeing these family stories are maybe actually influencing the work.
Right, so some of the ancestral influences in my character go back pretty far into the past, and I think this was a little bit influenced by traveling to Scotland. So the landscape that you see there is supposedly my ancestral homeland on the west coast of Scotland. My relatives apparently lived in this place, and while we were there, I was there with my mom, and she was really interested in this, in our research, and she actually had the idea. I don't know why I didn't have this idea to just go to the local library and ask the librarian, do you have any, materials about the McCaw family? And she found some things, and that is what eventually led us to this site. But then in subsequent research, I also ran across this book. I haven't been able to get my hands on the book. I've only seen pictures of the book, so that's the next thing. But The Witch of Bute, a story from Scotland, and it was written by John McCaw here. So I don't know what my relationship to John McCaw is, but I do know that this kind of witch story is part of my family lore. And the story that I know is that some of our family members were accused as witches, and then they were kind of banished from the island. And there is a history. This is the Isle of Bute in Scotland, and there is some history there of kind of like a witch hunt that happened, and people were banished to another island. And in some cases, they went all the way across the ocean to Nova Scotia. And that's actually what happened to my family too. So there is some connections, but these are all super loose connections. So most of the influence from my character is coming from such an ancient past, I only have like little tidbits to explore.
We found a gravestone on Butte, and it was a McCaw, and inscribed below it, it said, "The links are breaking one by one to bring us closer to our home."
Yeah, that was eerie, very eerie, but very interesting to find that. So this is just kind of another view of that room that my character gets to go into when she's not caretaking for this big mansion. And you can see it's full of all sorts of, like I said before, just like items from nature, everything from like berries and seeds to butterfly wings and salt and even things from far away that who knows how she would have gotten a hold of, like coral and shells and things like that. So yeah, she spends time in this room making things. And this is kind of, my imaginings of these ancestors, because I do know that sometimes women, especially who were healers or had special skills in medicine, were thought of as witches. And so I thought, well, maybe that's what she was doing.
Yeah, and it's quite ambiguous. She's sort of making this elixir of some sort, and at some point my character drinks it, or it's at least implied that he drinks it. He kind of gets sick, but it's a little bit ambiguous as to whether he's being poisoned or if this is some sort of reaction to it. I think like what we sort of thought about it was it created this kind of epiphany or the release for him, actually. So in some ways it's actually medicine. But it's a little ambiguous in the film.
Right. And then the other thing that happened when we were documenting this space is that we sometimes ended up with these images that were just like gorgeous paintings, almost like a Vermeer or something. And it was kind of a serendipity that happened. We didn't do anything to the room with lighting or anything to create, this particular image. It's just the way it was coming in the window and everything. But and I think because we had whitewashed the wallpaper, you get the brush strokes in the background, it kind of implies a painting. So this really unexpected image also just made us start to think about romanticism and how the past is often romanticized, and just kind of that idea of the bias of the storyteller, that the past is often, the story is rewritten for various purposes. And we have experienced that in our own families too, with our own kind of family historians or people doing genealogical research. They may decide to gloss over something or kind of change the story to make it more palatable. And so, so we know that those things are constantly happening, even in our own family histories.
So one of the prominent pieces you'll see in the gallery is this house frame, and it plays a prominent role in the film, and it's also exhibited as an installation in the gallery. In this photo, this is actually of an installation we did at Ripon College, along with the set which we built out on the prairie behind Ripon College. And so here my character is sort of dreaming up this house. He's sort of building it as a model first, so it kind of represents his ambition to build this place of comfort and security. So here, eventually he gets up the gumption to start the project, and he goes out onto the prairie and starts building it. So this is actually an early version of what you see in the gallery before it had been weathered or anything. So this is shortly after the construction has started. And we built this in such a way that we wanted to film it so it would appear to be full scale, but it's actually about half or 5/8 scale. So shot from afar with a certain angle, you can kind of read it as a full-scale house.
Yeah, there's a little bit of bizarre forced perspective going on with this piece that you can kind of sense in this photo.
Yeah, and so this was a film set, but it was also an installation, a sculpture. So this is there were trails outside there that so people could come and visit this and interact with it. It was up there for so intentionally we put it on the prairie where they do a prescribed burn as part of the management of the prairie. So our intention, and we've got permission for this and talked to the DNR and everything, and got permission to both erect it there but also be there with camera when the burn happened. They actually postponed the burn the first year because the weather conditions were never the right conditions that they could do it safely. So it started weathering, and it started graying, and it started falling apart, and it was subject to windstorms and rainstorms, and so it started becoming this ruin, and it started sort of collapsing in on itself in really interesting ways. We were at an artist residency at the Kohler Art Center, actually shooting another set for the film, which never made it in. when we got the call that they were going to do the burn, and we had like that day we had to figure it out. And so we called up Tate and we told him, and he dropped everything he was doing, and we all met and converged in Ripon on the prairie with our cameras, and we shot the burn. And the intention, of course, was to destroy the structure, and that would be the end of it, and it would be a sort of a climactic moment in the film. To our surprise, we got amazing footage of it, and it was a really beautiful experience to watch the burn. To our surprise, the house itself survived. And so now we were sort of burdened with this, the remnants of this thing, and we've been kind of trying to destroy it ever since. And so what we have in the gallery here is a new attempt to destroy it. And it's interesting because this piece is about failure, because my character sort of had the ambition to build it. He gave up at a certain point, so it's an unfinished frame. And then both, it's implied that he starts the fire in the film, and there's also another scene where he's trying to tear it down with the help of this like donkey. And so he wants to be rid of it and destroy it, but he can't quite seem to get rid of it.
So even his attempts at failure are a failure.
Right. So it represents some shame to him, right? Because he wasn't able to. Yeah. So he fails at failing. Yeah. And so interestingly, we decided here that we would hang the house from the ceiling and we'd tie it up in such a way that it would maybe kind of collapse in on itself a little bit. And so, we rigged up this pulley and we anchored it securely to the ceiling, and we started pulling on it, and I couldn't quite get it, so we brought John over there to help. And it got just to the point where it started stretching and sort of distorting, and then it just broke. So it never did end up being hung, but it sort of collapsed into this really interesting position. And so even that attempt for us to hang it in the gallery was sort of another iteration of this failure, which felt really, kind of perfect for the piece. And it just happened to land in this really interesting configuration. So we just, walked away and said, okay, that's it. That's the way it needs to be.
Yeah, that house is just a bizarre survivor in a way, and it's also become this burden in a way that we, every time we think it's just going to be, burnt to ashes and we won't have to deal with it ever again, then there's pieces we have to pick up and take with us back to our studio.
Yeah, so. And I think there's this theme in our work too, where while we're fascinated with our ancestry, we also struggle with our ancestry's sort of influence on our lives, and Shana calls it the ancestral tether. Mm-hmm. And it's sort of this, it's a burden as well, right? And so I think part of this is the struggle to be free of that burden.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's the end. But yeah, we're happy to take questions if anybody has one. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think so. I don't know if that was totally naive on our part or what, but yeah, because the wood itself had been weathering for a year, so it was extremely dry. The thing was like a pile of kindling. I really don't understand why it didn't burn, but in the end, I think when they decide to do a prairie burn, they usually try to pick a day that's nice and dry so everything will burn, but there's also a good breeze to push the fire along. So I think what actually happened was it just whipped through so fast it just didn't have chance to really catch the whole thing on fire. And so you will see in the gallery some charred elements, so it's not like it's completely pristine, but yeah, not enough to destroy it.
But you adapt, because the film has no script, so there was no scripted end. So it's sort of okay, we thought this was going to be the destruction of this piece and it would just be gone. It'd just be a pile of ashes, but that's not what happened. And so you adapt and you're oh, okay, well, this is a survivor. Yeah. So it sort of changes the narrative and you work from there. and move forward in this sort of different thread.
And, if it had been reduced to ashes, I could see us out there like gathering up some ashes so that we could use them in another art
Right,
piece
I'm
or
sure we
something.
would have, yeah.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Yes.
Is everything continue to work with the characters? Like, are the characters now just driving all over? And are they all
Yeah.
That's a good question, yeah.
Yeah, so I think we're actually looking for closure on the project
Yeah.
in some
At
ways.
this point, yeah.
And we have another show at the Alice Wilds Gallery in Milwaukee next year where our sort of rule we've set for ourselves is we can show anything except anything that has to do with this body of work.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because this has been such a huge part of our work for the past, couple decades, really, that I don't know, we find ourselves like doing these experiments and we feel like art students again, and we're making like all these things. A lot of them are failing and a lot of them are, it's like, we're sort of grasping a little bit. But it's also very exciting, because it's this like just opening up new avenues for inquiry. And I think like in some ways this, at least for me, this work is about my own flaws and about the sort of struggle in many ways. And so I think like the sort of desire for closure for me is to sort of package this all up and kind of move on to something else.
Yeah, and I do think that even when we give ourselves the assignment of doing our next show totally unrelated to the characters, so creating a whole new body of work, I know that influences from this body of work with the characters and our ancestry and maybe even the house will play into it somehow. We're just kind of not wanting to make direct connections.
Yeah, and it's not like a matter of like for me to like create that closure too, there's like a whole bunch of things we have to do between now and then. Like there's pieces that have to be made in order to like
finish it all up.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So there is more work coming, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by the concept of personal exploration in the pieces. As you portray to galleries that you document and portray to others, what does it feel like to gather the different reactions and contemplations of people on the work that is so personal to you?
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, you feel a little bit naked doing it, I think. Especially, I mean, it's interesting because we didn't intend these to be self-portraits. That's something that sort of came out of it. And we just sort of like, in trying to be true to the work, we started seeing how this was actually dealing with our own sort of psychology and our own issues. And I think there is something that feels very vulnerable about putting that out in the public sphere. But it's also really informative, because I think like a big thing we've studied along with this is sort of like kind of viewer reactions, and I think it's really interesting to watch other people like viewing our work and hear what they have to say about it. And those things come back, even those things that they see in it that we don't necessarily perceive or didn't intend in it, those sort of feed back into it and inform the work we do moving forward. So I think it's, while you feel vulnerable, I think I feel like art is a safe place to kind of express that, and I think the feedback has been really valuable for us to both evolve the work and just understand ourselves through it.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Yeah.
One thing I really enjoyed was watching the progression from your miniature scale houses, and then suddenly they became this huge structure in the middle of this field here. And I'm curious as to how that scale change affected maybe your other work. Like, did your other work also start small and then become very large, or was this very
Yeah.
unique to this?
That's an interesting thing. I mean, one thing I will say is I think it's somewhat correlated, honestly, with like the amount of space in which we had to work. because, I mean, if you have a small studio, you kind of just gravitate towards small objects because it's just very hard to figure out how to do large work in a small space. We started working modularly, though, at some point where it was like, all right, we will not be able to assemble this full thing in our space, but we can assemble the parts as long as we can get them through the door and into the elevator, all of those things. So, I mean, that's just kind of like a practical thing that I think was happening, because if I remember the studios that we were in, they were pretty cramped at first.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, we did kind of start to scale up just simply in response to the spaces in which we were given to work or to display the work. So on a prairie, I mean, a miniature wouldn't really work. It would just sort of get lost, So we did scale up at that point. But we've also always been interested in just kind of ambiguity of scale, where maybe from a distance you think you're looking at something full scale, and then when you approach it, you realize it's not quite right. So,
which is sort of why we started gravitating towards photography, because we were making these architectural miniatures, and then we were just photographing them because that's what you're supposed to do as an artist, right? Like document your work. But then what would happen is the photograph would erase all the scale cues, So all the things you see in your peripheral vision and everything that is sort of informing your scale relationship to that piece, those would disappear. And so, so suddenly, we have these images that look like they're like a convincing full-scale thing. So we started really thinking about how photography can kind of exploit that ambiguity of scale.
Yeah, in fact, after we made the miniature house, the more hyper-realistic one that you'll actually see in the show, we actually did a funny photo shoot once where we were really wanting to play with that idea. So we found a frozen lake in Wisconsin, and we took the house out to this frozen lake. It was a perfect day for it because the ice was not covered with snow or anything. It was like a nice ice slick. And we put the house out there, and there were like ice fishermen around, like doing their thing. And we were photographing the house from all different angles. And then this was back when like you got your photos developed by like bringing your film to like a photo developer, and maybe like a few days later you came back and they gave you the photos. And we went to collect the photos, and the guy was like, that must have been quite a flood. And we were like, he was convinced that was a real house. So that was really something that played into
And
it.
then we lost our insurance.
Oh, right.
Because the insurance company went to our website and they saw, I think, one of the images we showed you before of the house with the smoke coming out of it.
Yeah.
And they like thought we were like burning houses down.
They did.
And we tried to explain this to them, but they're just like that. They didn't want to have anything to do with us.
Yeah. So I mean, but those things did play into our understanding that these were photography was really transforming them. So that was interesting to us.
I think we have to end it here so you can enjoy the exhibit, but these were some great questions, and thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
The conversation continues across the way.
Thank you.
Thank you all.